It happened on a cold morning when the sky looked as heavy as the fate waiting inside the courthouse. A lone biker stood at the steps, shoulders squared, jaw tense, carrying a burden far larger than the charges with his name on them. He had taken the blame for something he hadn't done, not out of fear nor recklessness, but out of a fierce, unbreakable loyalty to his younger brother. And in that quiet tension before the doors opened, he felt the weight of a sacrifice only a few could ever truly understand. Inside the courthouse, whispers traveled like cold drafts, slipping between benches and echoing faintly beneath the high ceilings. People spoke of him as though he were already condemned, a man who lived on the edge and now had fallen off it. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the brother who stood trembling at home, haunted by a mistake he had tried to confess but was urged to bury. They didn't know about the promise made between them when they were young. One would always protect the other, no matter the cost. The biker's lawyer begged him to reconsider, to tell the truth before it was too late. But his answer never changed. "My brother deserves to live," he whispered, eyes filled with a tired but unwavering resolve. "I'll carry this." The lawyer saw the depth of that devotion, the kind rarely witnessed outside of stories passed down through generations. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't pride. It was love, the kind forged through shared scars, shared fights, and shared nights spent surviving a world that had not been kind to either of them. And yet, as the biker stepped inside the courtroom, he had no idea what awaited him beyond those walls. He believed he would face the judge alone, that the world would turn its back on him, that sacrifice meant silence. But outside, just beyond his sight, motorcycles began appearing one by one like shadows rising from the morning mist. Engines rumbled softly, steadily, gathering strength as more and more arrived. Not 10, not 50, not 100. By sunrise, 300 bikers stood shoulder to shoulder, surrounding the courthouse in absolute silence. No shouting, no threats, no chaos, just a wall of unwavering solidarity, their presence speaking louder than any protest ever could. And inside, as the biker prepared to face the judge, he had no idea that the moment he looked out those courtroom doors, his entire world would shift. Inside the courtroom, the biker kept his gaze steady, refusing to let the fear beneath his ribs show. Every word spoken, every question asked, felt like another stone added to the weight he carried. The prosecutor painted him as reckless, dangerous, and irresponsible. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He absorbed each blow quietly, because he knew that the truth, if revealed, would destroy his younger brother's future. And so he stood there alone, choosing silence over self-preservation. But something shifted the moment the judge requested a brief recess. A bailiff entered the room, leaned toward the judge, and whispered something with wide eyes and trembling hands. Confusion rippled across the courtroom like a sudden breeze. The biker frowned, unable to imagine what could possibly cause such a reaction. The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and ordered everyone to remain seated. A tension, thick, electric, settled over the room. When the biker finally turned toward the courtroom doors, he felt his breath catch. Through the small rectangular window, he saw it. An unmoving wall of leather jackets, chrome glints, and steady eyes. 300 bikers stood packed around the entrance, their posture calm but resolute. No one shouted. No one moved. They simply existed there as a single, unbreakable unit. It was as if loyalty itself had taken physical form and arrived to stand beside him. The judge, puzzled and visibly uneasy, asked the bailiff who they were. "His people," the bailiff answered softly. The words seemed to echo, bouncing off the wooden walls, sinking into every ear present. His people, a phrase that changed the temperature of the room instantly. Because in that moment, everyone understood, he was not a man abandoned. He was a man defended, fiercely, silently, and without condition. The biker's eyes burned, not with fear, but with something deeper, realization. He had walked into the courthouse, convinced he was making this sacrifice alone. Now, through that small window, he finally saw the truth. Loyalty given selflessly has a way of returning multiplied. The brotherhood he had protected in silence had come to protect him in a silence even louder. Outside, the air trembled with the low growl of hundreds of engines idling in perfect patience. The townspeople gathered around the courthouse couldn't believe what they were witnessing. These weren't men driven by anger or rebellion. They weren't here to threaten or intimidate. They stood there in disciplined stillness, each biker a pillar of quiet resolve, refusing to let their brother face judgment alone. And that silence, so powerful, so deliberate, began to spread through the crowd like a rising tide of respect. News reporters rushed to the scene, cameras trembling as they captured the surreal image of the courthouse surrounded by a sea of motorcycles. People watching from afar wondered what kind of man inspired such loyalty. They expected hostility, confrontation, chaos. Instead, they found unity, honor, and a brotherhood bound by something deeper than blood. It became clear that this wasn't a spectacle. It was a vow. Inside, the judge glanced between the biker and the crowd outside, as if piecing together a puzzle he didn't know he had been handed. He cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Why are they here?" he asked. The biker hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He hadn't asked for them. He hadn't expected them. He had only acted to protect his younger brother. And now, faced with the judge's question, he could only offer the truth he knew. "Because loyalty means something to us." The judge studied him closely. Something in the biker's voice, soft, steady, unpretentious, shifted the tone of the room once more. Gone was the image of a reckless troublemaker. In its place stood a man who knew sacrifice, who understood responsibility, who carried burdens without complaint. The kind of man who would rather lose his freedom than let someone he loved be destroyed by a single mistake. The courtroom became still as that truth settled into every heart present. Meanwhile, on the courthouse steps, one biker stepped forward and placed his hand on the shoulder of the biker's younger brother, who had finally gathered the courage to come. Tears streamed down the younger man's face as he stared at the courthouse doors, knowing his brother was inside, facing consequences meant for him. Surrounded by 300 men who stood for loyalty, he felt his own fear begin to crumble. Inside the courtroom, the younger brother's sudden appearance sent a tremor through the biker's chest. He hadn't expected to see him, hadn't wanted him exposed to this moment. But there he stood, wide-eyed and trembling, surrounded by the same brotherhood that had watched him grow up, the same men who now stood ready to protect both siblings with their silent presence. The biker felt a surge of conflict, relief that his brother wasn't hiding anymore, and fear that the truth might spill out before he could stop it. The judge, noticing the emotional shift, allowed the younger brother to step forward. The room held its breath as he approached the witness stand, hands shaking, eyes glistening. He took a deep breath, preparing to speak, but his older brother tensed instantly, his voice deep and urgent. "Don't," he whispered, not loudly enough for the courtroom, but enough for him. It was the same tone he had used years earlier when shielding him from trouble, the same tone that had always meant, "I've got you. Let me carry this." The younger brother froze, torn between guilt and gratitude. He knew the weight of what his brother was doing, knew the sentence he could face, the years he could lose. And yet, when he looked into his brother's eyes, he saw not fear, but certainty. The older brother didn't regret taking the blame. Not for a second. It wasn't heroism. It was instinct, forged through decades of surviving side by side. But the younger man's heart twisted painfully at the realization that his silence was becoming another burden for the brother who had already carried too much. Meanwhile, the bikers outside remained motionless, forming a ring of living steel around the courthouse. Their presence wasn't meant to sway the law. It was meant to anchor the two brothers inside, to remind them that neither was alone. A few officers approached, uncertain whether the group was preparing to protest, but they were met with calm nods and respectful silence. The unity was so strong, so grounded, that even the police felt compelled to maintain the same quiet dignity. The judge watched the tension between the brothers with keen eyes. He saw the conflict, the sacrifice, the unspoken love binding them together. And something in that raw display of loyalty seemed to strike him deeper than the legal documents before him. For the first time, he leaned back in his chair, his expression softening with empathy, as though he were beginning to understand that this case was not merely about law. It was about family, loyalty, and the weight of choosing to protect someone you love. As the younger brother sat down, still visibly shaken, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The biker kept his stare forward, jaw clenched, trying to regain control of his emotions. But the judge, now seeing the pieces align, requested a brief private meeting with both brothers and their attorney. This unusual request stirred murmurs among the spectators. The biker stood, uncertain and wary, but followed the instructions with the same stoic calm he had shown all morning. Inside the judge's chambers, the atmosphere shifted. Gone were the rigid formality and cold distance. Instead, the judge spoke with a quiet steadiness that surprised both brothers. He asked them to explain, not for the official record, but for clarity, for understanding. Slowly, painfully, the truth emerged. The younger brother had made a mistake on a dark night, one he regretted instantly, one that could shatter his future. And without hesitation, the older brother had stepped forward to shoulder the blame. The judge listened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen countless cases lacking anything resembling loyalty or remorse. Here, in front of him, stood two men prepared to sacrifice for each other in ways the world rarely acknowledged. It wasn't lawlessness he saw. It was love. It was responsibility. It was the complicated, messy courage of a man willing to give up his freedom so his brother could have one. When they returned to the courtroom, something had shifted. The judge's tone was different now, calmer, more deliberate. He addressed the biker directly, acknowledging the depth of his loyalty while also reminding him that justice required truth, not silence. But before he could continue, a sudden movement drew every eye to the back of the courtroom. The younger brother rose to his feet again, shoulders trembling, voice cracking as he spoke. "I can't let him do this," he said softly. "Not anymore." The confession rippled through the courtroom like an unexpected gust of wind. Gasps echoed, reporters leaned forward, and even the bikers outside seemed to feel the shift. The older brother closed his eyes, a mixture of frustration, fear, and relief washing over him all at once. And for the first time since the trial began, the judge allowed himself a small, human sigh, one that suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, the truth was finally making its way to the surface. The judge's chambers had revealed truths that reshaped the entire courtroom, but the real turning point came when the younger brother stepped forward, alone, vulnerable, voice trembling with the weight of honesty. His confession was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the gravity of a heart finally refusing to hide in the dark. The biker beside him felt his breath falter. He had spent countless nights preparing himself to carry the blame, but nothing had prepared him for the moment his brother finally stood up to carry his own truth. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying the younger brother with renewed intensity. He wasn't looking at a criminal. He was looking at a young man suffocating under remorse, courage forcing its way through fear. "Why now?" the judge asked quietly. The younger brother swallowed hard. "Because he shouldn't lose his life for my mistake," he whispered. "He protected me my whole life. It's time I protect him." Those words, raw and unpolished, cracked something open in the room. In the silence that followed, the older brother lowered his head, torn between pride and fear. He wanted to protect his brother from consequences, from pain, from the world itself. But now the roles had shifted. His brother wasn't the trembling boy he had shielded for so many years. He was a man, flawed, afraid, but finally willing to stand tall. And as that realization settled, the biker felt something unexpected wash over him. Relief. Not because the truth was out, but because his brother had found his voice. Outside, the sea of bikers noticed the change in atmosphere. They may not have heard the confession, but they sensed a shift, an invisible tremor passing through the courthouse doors, touching each of them like a quiet signal. Their silence deepened. Their posture sharpened. Loyalty wasn't just standing guard anymore. It was preparing to witness the heart of justice unfold. The Brotherhood understood that this moment was bigger than a verdict. It was a reckoning of love, truth, and sacrifice. Inside, the judge called for order. The weight of what he'd witnessed could not be ignored. Two brothers bound by loyalty, one willing to fall for the other. And now, another willing to rise. The judge exhaled slowly, as though carrying the burden of the decision with the same heaviness the brothers carried their bond. And with careful deliberation, he announced that he would review both testimonies before rendering judgment. But something in his voice hinted that compassion and truth had finally found a place in his considerations. The courtroom adjourned temporarily, and the biker stepped outside for the first time since the proceedings began, pushing through the heavy wooden doors to meet the world waiting beyond them. What he found made his breath stop. 300 bikers stood perfectly still, forming a corridor of leather and steel that stretched down the courthouse steps. No chaos, no yelling, just unwavering support etched into every face. It was a sight so powerful that the biker felt his knees weaken. As the brothers stepped side by side through that corridor, the younger one still trembling from the confession, the bikers bowed their heads slightly, a gesture of respect, solidarity, and silent pride. They weren't judging either of them. They weren't questioning the choices that had brought them here. They understood the complexities of brotherhood, the pain of sacrifice, the courage it takes to tell the truth. To them, this wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about loyalty, lived deeply and fiercely. The younger brother struggled to hold himself together as they walked, guilt swirling inside him like a storm. But the older brother placed a steady hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "You did the right thing," he murmured. For the first time in months, the younger man felt a flicker of hope. Amid the fear and uncertainty, he realized something profound. His brother didn't resent him. He never had. And that forgiveness, silent, unconditional, was something he would carry for the rest of his life. By the time the judge called everyone back inside, a strange calm had fallen over the courthouse. The brothers returned to their seats, steadier now, strengthened by the bond that had guided them through each painful step. The judge reviewed the new testimonies, the evidence, and the emotional truth he had witnessed firsthand. His verdict would determine their futures, but one thing was already certain. The brothers were no longer facing this moment alone. As the judge prepared to speak, the biker took one last look through the courtroom window. Outside, 300 bikers waited in silence, unmoving, unshaken, unbreakable. And in that moment, he understood the real meaning of brotherhood. It wasn't just about riding together. It wasn't about loyalty in the easy moments. It was about standing through the storms, through the sacrifices, through the truths that hurt but heal. Whatever happened next, he knew this. Love and loyalty would carry him through it. When the judge finally returned with his decision, the courtroom fell into a silence so deep it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Both brothers stood shoulder to shoulder, no longer divided by guilt or sacrifice, but united by truth. What the judge had witnessed that day was more than a legal dispute. It was a human story, raw and unfiltered. A story of love strong enough to face judgment, of loyalty powerful enough to move 300 men to stand watch, and of courage found not in the absence of fear, but in the choice to confront it. The verdict reflected this truth. Though accountability was required, compassion shaped the path forward. The younger brother would face consequences proportionate to his mistake, tempered by his honesty and willingness to come forward. The older brother, whose sacrifice was born from love rather than malice, was granted leniency. It wasn't a perfect ending, nor a fairy tale resolution, but it was just. And sometimes, justice touched by empathy becomes something greater than a simple ruling. It becomes healing. As they stepped out of the courthouse, the brothers were met with a sight they would remember for the rest of their lives. The 300 bikers who had stood in absolute silence all morning now straightened, shoulders lifted, eyes fixed on the two men emerging from the doors. And for the first time that day, the silence broke, not with cheers or shouts, but with the soft, steady rumble of engines starting up in unison. It was a noise. It was a salute, a recognition of the courage both brothers had shown. The older brother looked at his younger sibling, who wiped tears from his eyes as he gazed at the sea of riders ready to escort them home. What had begun as a burden carried in isolation had transformed into a moment shared by a brotherhood that understood pain, redemption, and loyalty. The lesson became unmistakable. When a person chooses love over pride, truth over silence, and courage over fear, the world around them responds. sometimes with thunder, sometimes with silence, but always with impact. And as this story reaches you now, let it remind you of the power found in standing by those you love and in owning the truth even when it hurts. If this journey moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on your own bonds, consider supporting this space where stories like this come alive. Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and like the video so more people can experience narratives that touch the heart. Your presence here helps these stories continue and keeps their messages alive long after the screen goes dark.